I love routers. There, I've said it, and I'm not even ashamed of it. I love routers. I think they are the most versatile tool in the entire shop. If somebody told me that I had to give up every power tool that I own and only keep one, I think I'd probably choose a router. Now, to be fair, in order for a router to have any value at all, you've got to have router bits. And fortunately, unfortunately for me, I've got a lot of router bits. I tend to collect them, like some guys collect hand planes. I have router bits for things that I will probably never ever use them for, like the time when I thought, oh yeah, I'll totally make my own crown molding. Just no. Goal, of course, was to get all of my router bits out of the drawer where they've been living all this time and into some kind of a box or case where I could easily get to what I need and that would keep them out of harm's way and not knocking into one another and chipping the cutting edges. To put together a couple of boxes, and I ended up using just common white pine. I really don't like pine. I really don't like pine. But it was cheap and readily available and, well, cheap. I decided when building these boxes that I would use a new router bit that I had gotten recently that makes a locking miter joint. I hadn't used this particular type of joint before, but it looked interesting and this would be a good excuse to try it out. It did require a little bit of setup on the router table, futzing around with the fence distance from the bit and the bit height, but once it was set up and dialed in okay, it was actually relatively easy to get the other pieces run through and it produced a fairly clean cut. I did find that it was absolutely necessary to use a backer board behind the cut though. If you didn't, particularly maybe it was due to this lousy white pine, but if you didn't use a backer board, it just blew out the back side of the cut really bad. The box construction here is as straightforward as it could possibly be. Four sides held together in the corners with these locking miters, and for the back these are going to be holding quite a few router bits, and I was concerned about the weight, so I ended up using 1/2-inch plywood, and in order to support that plywood I cut a 1/2-inch dado on all four pieces except the back. My plan for these boxes included a hinge lid with a clear plastic inset, both to keep dust out and to make it easier to spot the bit that I was looking for. As I mentioned, the cabinet backs are 1/2-inch construction grade plywood. There's absolutely no reason to use the expensive stuff. I have put together lots of mitered boxes in my life, and I have to say that these locking miter joints really did make it easier. In most cases when gluing together something like this, you'd have to tape the edges and hold things together in a way that they didn't slide apart. This made it a lot easier. I was able to just slap the joints together, put a back on, and clamp it up and pin nail it. Mental note for next time, ease up on the glue. There was a ton of squeeze out. Even though joints came together pretty well, I did find that it was a lot easier to use a couple of clamps to pull things in tight and then nail it. Trying to do that by hand inadvertently left some little gaps here and there. There's some of that white pine blowout I told you about earlier. Just stuff just splinters when you're routing it. Cutting plexiglass for the box lids is super simple. Just get yourself one of these cheapy, I don't know what they are, sheet good plastic cutters. It's like a little hook knife, but it has a triangular shaped tip on it, and makes quick work of getting through a sheet enough that you can snap it off. The lids came together real nice. The plastic sat in its little dado nicely without sagging, held nice and tight. The plexiglass actually helped to firm up and prevent racking on the lid a little bit, which was nice. I did go through and putty all the nail holes and do some light sanding. You know, we're not barbarians. You so much as sneeze on white pine, it will splinter or crack in some unpredictable way. It probably would have been better for me to build this thing out of maple, but the cost would have been quite a bit higher, and I didn't have the maple on hand. If you install any quantity of hinges at all, it would absolutely benefit you to get a set of these drill bits. They've got a little spring-loaded plunger tip, and they make aligning the drill bit in the center of the hinge hole much, much easier. I ran all the hinge screws in by hand because I just don't trust this pine to hold a screw that's been run in by a driver. To actually hold all the router bits themselves, I really wanted to use a piece of sheet plastic. You know, you could certainly drill a bunch of holes into a piece of plywood, but plywood, like any other wood product, always has a certain amount of moisture in it. And I have seen router bit shafts get rusted by sitting inside of custom-made wood holders. In this particular case, the cheapest source for a piece of sheet plastic was this cutting board, which was 18 inches by 24 inches and a full 1 inch thick. I found it on Amazon. They weren't even that expensive. Every other source I found for sheet plastic wanted an arm and a leg for it, but cutting boards, dirt cheap. A spacing of 1.5 inches down both the width and the length of the board ended up being the spacing that worked the best for me. If you've got a lot of really small router bits, maybe a narrower spacing would work better. You could certainly pack a lot more bits onto the same board, but this to me was a good compromise between the real small bits and the really large ones. I left the cellophane on the cutting board as I was doing all of my marking. That ended up working pretty well. It allowed me to trace out a grid, and then after the grid was drawn in, I went back with an awl and punched a hole at each one of the locations where I wanted to have a hole drilled. To make that a little bit easier for me to find, since it is a white cutting board, I went over each hole before I pulled the plastic off with a little dab from a Sharpie. That gave me a very visible black dot on the sheet and made cutting all of the holes pretty simple. Next up was to drill 1 million holes. Well, not that many obviously, but it sure felt like it. Part of what took so long was that I had to stop the drill press periodically and clear all the little plastic giblets off of the drill bit. It took quite a while to get through them. But once I got them all drilled, I went through and chamfered each one of the holes individually. I figured this would make inserting each of the router bits into their respective slots a little bit easier. I don't know if this was absolutely necessary, but it turned out nice and it certainly looks good. This particular board was drilled for 1/2 inch router bits, which are mostly what I own. If you're going to cut holes for 1/2 inch router bits, you can't use a 1/2 inch drill bit. It just makes it too tight. You really need to use a 13 millimeter drill bit. After all the holes were drilled in the plastic, I marked each hole's location on the back of the board using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit and just tapping it with a hammer. This gave me a small indentation that I would use later. I then proceeded to drill a small locator hole all the way through the back to give myself a point of reference on the back side of the board. After flipping the case over, it was easy to see the exact location of every router bit's hole. I set up a 1/4 inch drill bit with a stop collar that was sized to just under a 1/2 inch. The idea here was for me to be able to drill holes through the back and leave just a very small bit of the plywood on the other side intact, maybe like a 1/16 of an inch or so. I picked up a quantity of these small magnets. They're really, really strong magnets, and they're about 3/8 of an inch long and about 1/4 of an inch thick. And the idea here was to hot glue one into each one of the holes that I had made earlier. And to do that, I just dropped a small amount of hot glue into each hole, tapped it in with a hammer, and moved on to the next one. This process took a little while. The small relief hole that I had drilled all the way through earlier provided a perfect place for the excess glue to ooze out. So after I flipped the cabinet back over, I just took a chisel and knocked off all the little glue blobs. To hold the lid closed, I installed a pair of inexpensive magnetic catches. This required that I put a small glue block on the lid side to hold the strike plate. To hold the plastic sheet into the cabinet, I just drilled holes all the way through from the back, installed the plastic sheet, and drove some screws through from the back. Now you can see with the plastic sheet installed, there's a small drilled hole in place of where every router bit will mount, and right behind that hole, just with a very small amount of material left, is a magnet. The idea with the magnet here is obviously to keep these router bits from falling out of the holes that they're in. My intent is to wall mount this, and I didn't want the router bits to vibrate out or walk out of the holes that they were in. The magnet provides just enough catch to kind of lock the bit in place without making it difficult to remove. Next, it was time to load it up with bits. Router bit porn. And there we go. Made a couple of simple French cleats from a 2x4 scrap that I had on hand. Attached that securely to the back of another tool cabinet in the workshop and hung it up. I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully this will give you some good ideas for building your own router bit storage.